These little things called GUIDs bring a lot of power and a lot of functionality to the way that you utilize the data that's stored in your tables in your database. And so in this video, I want to go through some basics to help you understand GUIDs. Now let's go back to basic table structure rule number 1. All rows must be unique in that table. Now that's great for each table, and certainly every row should be unique. But what happens when we need to maintain unique values across all tables in the database, or even across multiple databases, across multiple servers? That gets a little more challenging. And in the real world, this is ultimately what ends up happening to your data. Because as your databases grow, and as people start to realize what can be accomplished with these things, people start to begin to spread their data all over the place, and they start to share them with other departments, and then we start to buy up other companies and we bring their data in and so forth. And you start needing to merge data, but some of those numbers and some of those rows could accidentally be identical. So the GUID comes to the rescue here. What is a GUID? Now you're going to hear this thing called everything in the world out there. I've heard it called a GUID. I've heard it called a GUID. I've heard it called a GUID. Whatever you want to call it, it stands for Globally Unique Identifier. Now, a globally unique identifier is a generated value. It's 4 bytes long, that's 128 bits in length, and this number is guaranteed to be unique across every table, database, server, anything in the world. Now, I've seen the numbers on this, and it varies depending on who you talk to, but if I generate a globally unique identifier, and then you generate one, you would have to generate something like 600 million global unique identifiers to have a 50% chance of duplicating mine. Now, this thing builds it off of all kinds of things, including the MAC address on your network card. So it's very, very unlikely that you're ever going to see a duplicate of this. Now, if we were to generate a globally unique identifier and then insert it into each row in our tables, we would then have a way to uniquely identify the row regardless of how or where we use it, where we pump it to, where we store it. And this is especially useful in things like data warehousing. Then, like I said before, merging data between two companies, between two departments. And now in some larger enterprises, you have legal recommendations and legal requirements that you have to maintain data identity. Globally unique identifiers can help you do that. Now, T-SQL and SQL Server 2012 provide functionality for creating these things. There is a unique identifier data type that I can assign to a column, and then I can use the new ID function when I insert into that column to generate a global unique identifier. Now, I'll show you an example of that in a video entitled GUID Examples, or Global Unique Identifier Examples. So look for that video and you'll see those code examples. And by the way, that code will be out there in your working files folder. Now, along with the new ID function, there's a new one here called new sequential ID function, because now's where we start to get the rub in databases that we get all the time in databases. And that is every time we come up with a solution to a problem, it solves that problem, but it tends to create one or two other potential problems. And that certainly happens here. If I generate a global unique identifier using the new ID function, it just randomly generates one. Well, if I go to the next row, new ID, it randomly generates one. Next row, it randomly generates it. Now, if I'm ever going to be searching based on that globally unique identifier, and they're not in any particular order, that's going to present a problem. And it can present some other problems as well. Don't want to go too deep here, but the new sequential ID can solve that. Now, the new ID function generates a globally unique identifier when new ID is used to provide a value for a column that has been set with the unique identifier data type. And I'll demonstrate that in the globally unique identifier examples video. Now, the new sequential ID function generates new IDs that are sequential. This can, in some cases, provide better performance depending on how you're using them. However, there can also be a security risk here, because once I can figure out that you're using sequential IDs, I can guess what the next globally unique identifier can be or will be, and I can also guess what the last 2, 3, 4, 5 were. Now, there are some other things Don't mention this on the exam, but watch for these new sequential IDs out there in the real world. They're not exactly behaving as advertised. They are sequential, and it's supposed to be sequential until you restart the machine. It may go back and start earlier and with a lower value and stay sequential, but it's not always doing that. Sometimes it's just kind of starting over and dropping down to lower values. So just be aware, that's the fine print. Just go out and read about this and make sure you're up to speed on it before you use it. But that's kind of the bottom line on globally unique identifiers. And we will go out now and work on the global unique identifier examples video. So join me there and we'll look at what this thing looks like in code.